Okay, I'm here with Chobra. I'm going to do a reflections interview with him. And so anyone who's watching this now and doesn't know who Chobra is, I did like a really long grilled episode with him. So rather than recover all that, just go and watch that yourself. Like pause this, come back. And so we'll kind of pick up to some degree like a year on from there. And so the first place I want to start with you actually is when we were discussing before, one of the key topics a year ago when League was like still growing in Korea was like, oh, is it going to become like the new Brood War? Like, can it be like a social phenomenon like that? At the time, okay, you could say like, oh, it seems like it, and but it was still hard to fully know. Like, for all you know, maybe 6 months later it would have died down and you go, oh no, maybe it was just a fad. Like, what is the kind of diagnosis of that now?
I'd say for one, it's definitely stagnated a little bit. By all means, player size, player pool is huge, and so I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but I'm sure that's comparable. What I do notice is, so the same people are still playing it, and people who have gone into League are still playing it, but the difference it has from, say, Brood War is that there's not enough, I guess, individual motivation to continue playing the game. For instance, Brood War, of course, at the base, StarCraft is a 1 versus 1 game. So even if you didn't want to climb ladder or play any of that, you could always be like, hey, you want to play a one-on-one? And just have bets with your friends, or like whoever loses buys dinner. That kind of culture was always growing. But with League, you can't really do that, So the positive of League is you can play as a team, you can get 4 of your friends together and have a good time, but at the same time, there's no incentive on your own to keep playing for fun or with just one other friend, especially if you're now used to playing with 4 other friends. Say one has to, go study or goes on vacation. Suddenly that fun gets decreased, or you feel that it's decreased by a certain %. And that's what I've been hearing more and more this year, actually, talking to a lot of my friends here that I've reconnected with, or their friends. They tell me, yeah, just sometimes it feels that we're just doing a mundane day-by-day thing when we play League. We still play it because it is a fun game, and that's the biggest game and everyone's playing it still, but I don't see that drive. For instance, Brood War, when I came to Korea last year, I could still see people, now and then playing it in the PC cafes, and the way they talk, it's that there's still this competitive spirit in them amongst their friends. But with League, it's hard to do that. The only way you can really compete with your friends is either if you have a full 10 in-house, or if you're comparing rankings. You can't really test your mettle other than simple one-on-ones in lane. So I think that is, it will be interesting to see how that pans out over the next year, actually. I wonder if that's going to have a big enough impact on how League grows. What I do notice, especially for myself also, is the recent patches at least have breathed some new life into League as a whole game, and I think that will keep people going. But it's a different element because it's a team game at heart, and I'd love to see how that affects the Korean kind of competitive nature and always having to one-up your friends.
One of the things that's always really hard to like get a good gauge on, I think, is like, okay, the game penetration into society can be really big, but how much of that actually gets converted over to esports? So if I've been in PC banks here where it's like there's full of people playing League, but I get the sense that like a lot of them probably have no clue what OGN is, probably don't watch Masters or Champions or anything, and like they just play it as a fun game. They just do it as like League's like a free game that we play for fun with friends. It's not necessarily like people in the West, if they hear how big League is, they're going to think that like, okay, if Reaper goes into a cafe, then every single person there's like, wow, it's Reaper. Like, I get the sense he could walk in and like maybe like 3 guys would know who he was, and the rest would just be like just another guy playing League. What is it actually like, do you think, in terms of like the conversion of people who are playing over to the esports side in Korea?
Yeah, so it's probably lower than what a lot of people in the West fantasize about. Like you said, it's not going to be that an esports personality walks in and the whole cafe goes wild. No, it's not like that at all. In fact, I had an experience where I got to go to a PC bang with Nalra once, and we just like played all night, overnight, and we had maybe like 2 to 3 people come up and be like, oh, like you're Nal Ra, right? And one of the people working there recognized him, but that was also his kind of hometown area. So he's been around, and people have known him to go visit that cafe. And when I play with, say, acquaintances of my other friends or different coaches, a lot of them will often ask, oh, so like what is popular in tournament play these days? Because they don't watch. They just know we're involved in the scene. So I'd say it's, especially just given the number of players, the actual percentage is probably small because the player pool is so big. But on the flip side, of course, there have been records of viewer numbers for tournaments or finals, even domestically. And I remember, for instance, the Masters opening day was actually ranked high enough that it could compete with a lot of just the main channels that aren't on cable, and that's just an impressive feat for any cable channel at all. So the viewing numbers are there, but compared to the actual player pool in Korea, where I would say the fantasy is much more true that almost everyone has or is playing League, yeah, the percentage is probably a lot smaller.
A question I wanted to ask about like the community in Korea is about, you know, when there was like a leak of Imp saying about how you know his rivalry with Piglet, and how, you know, his blood pressure rises if someone says that Piglet's better than him. Like in the West, if you hear that, that's like, oh, that's cool. That's like, there's real animosity there. Like I can't wait to watch them play again. It's like, it kind of like builds it up and it's kind of like adds something to it. Okay, but I saw that from the little like leaked onto Reddit. It sounded like the backlash was like insane against Imp, and then similarly when Piglet had like some BM on solo queue, he had to like fully apologize. Like what was actually the scope of this? Like were they in real trouble? Did the fans turn against them? What was it like?
So I think another thing, I mean, especially in the current day and age, any region, the online communities have a lot more power now than they ever had, right? Just the impact they have with their reactions is pretty big. In Korea, that's been true since even the 90s. Just the term netizens comes to mind in Korea. It's a very common thing, whether it's politics, esports, and I'd say those two instances that you mentioned, they were big enough. The issue is that they were big enough that the administration was worried for each team. Even if, because of the sponsorship and things like that, even if, say, the player could probably go on living, you know, being a professional player, and if he wins, he gets the money, no big deal, he's going to have fans. But if the community starts hating on the player, that in turn might turn over to hate for the sponsor, which will be these big companies, Samsung, SKT. And they had to be a little bit concerned. Piglet and Imp are also notorious for having a history of BM before they became professional players, and I think that's why it was highlighted a bit more. Especially in the case of Imp, everyone, or a lot of his anti-fans, used to criticize him for being too arrogant. Like, oh, you're not that good. Like, calm down a little bit. And because of that, anytime he steps a little bit out of boundary, it blows out of proportion. Similar thing with Piglet, but Piglet, of course, proved himself by winning the World Championship last year, so things are a little bit different. And same for Imp now. And you can see both of them have really calmed down, even in interviews. If they get MVP or if they get team interviews, they're a lot more careful and, I guess, modest in how they phrase their wording. So I would say, yeah, it's just something that the administration is, I think, much more aware of, and it's not that rivalries are looked down upon. So that's not true. I don't want people to get that misconception. For instance, you know, dade and Faker, that's a huge deal in Korea or anywhere in the world now, and people love that because neither dade nor Faker have really stepped out of line in how they attack the other player.
So explain this to me. In what context are you allowed to sort of like trash talk? Because on one hand, okay, so say someone watches StarCraft and they only watch Western tournaments, then whenever a Korean player is interviewed on stage, they will be hyper polite. Like they'll even lie and be like, no, I think this Zerg player from Sweden has a chance to beat me and I'll try very hard, like even if it's just not even true, you know. Whereas I've seen, like, when they have all Korean finals in the Korean leagues, it's like they go the other way. They'll even say stuff like, I remember a famous one was when like Jangbi and Fantasy were playing each other, and they both were famous for always coming second, and they both, like, all their trash talk was like, I'm going to make sure you're remembered as the one who always comes second, and like just really harsh stuff like that, you know. You think like, what? So in what context are you allowed to trash talk, and what kind of things are you allowed to say? Like, how come that's acceptable but then it's not to be like just honest and say like, I think this guy's not as good as me, like Imp did, you know?
I would say the biggest thing is backhanded remarks are acceptable. Yeah, I'd say that's the best way to do it. It's because, especially in the case of Imp and Piglet, they would be vulgar. You know, that's the biggest issue there. Their language itself would be vulgar, and so it's not necessarily how harshly they criticize the other's play, but it was just the words they use. You know, if they're like, oh, well, you're a piece of bleep, blah, 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 it's like, okay, maybe that's not so acceptable. But I mean, even in League, you know, we've had players. One of my favorites is like, oh, thank you, Loco, for like tumbling forward and giving us the kill, you know, to win the game. Things like that. when Loco was still a player. Those are becoming more commonplace, and I would say those comments, I think fans even in Korea are willing to enjoy. They're willing to appreciate kind of the sarcasm, but once it goes over to vulgar language, it gets a little bit iffy. And just my experience with vulgar language in Korean and English is that Korea seems to have like a bigger gap between acceptable, like commonplace vulgar language, and then ones that even in commonplace are not so acceptable even among friends. Whereas English, whether it's because everything's been dumbed down a little bit or whatever the effect is, there's just more words that people are willing to accept. And so anytime those kind of negative buzzwords come out, that's when people start to get a little bit concerned. And that was the biggest issue with Imp and Piglet, is that their word choices were just not acceptable socially.
Originally, there used to be this misconception that like everyone is so polite in Korea and there's formal language and stuff, and so you don't ever have to worry about how horrible like the nasty Reddit is in the West and how pro players have it so hard there. And we explained in our last interview it can be the other way sometimes. Actually, they can be even harsher. What I want to know is are there any people who have like special immunity from that? Is there some, like for example, if SK Telecom's doing badly but Faker was still playing very well and he looked like he was still a top player, does he get like exception from that from the fans? Do they still criticize him like, you're the star, you should carry the team? Are there certain players, like if Flame does well and Blaze aren't doing well themselves, does he kind of get like a pass for that at all, or does he get just as harsh criticism? What do you think?
I would say definitely certain players have free passes, Faker being one of them. The one I remember is during Masters when I was casting it, a Faker completely whiffed an Orianna ultimate and it just didn't do enough damage. He flashed forward and it didn't get the kill because he wasn't level 11. A very uncharacteristic mistake for Faker for not calculating his level and damage. When that play happened, and just browsing through the Korean community, it's just like, they'll be like, oh, well, it was nice to see Faker's human. Kind of similar reactions as America, where they'll let him get by with certain mistakes. And even now, people would just be like, Faker, he seems to be slumping a little bit, or, oh, he's getting a little bit arrogant. But they won't be like, oh, Faker, come on, like, oh, like, you used to carry the team. Why can't you carry the team? Like, are you not good enough anymore? Like, that kind of remarks actually don't come out to him. Flame, like you mentioned, used to get free passes. Not so much anymore. I would say Flame is a bit half and half now. And it's just anytime a team wins or is about to win a tournament, the star player on that team gets a little bit of temporary immunity. And thankfully for Faker, he continued that for so long that even during their quote-unquote slump, he's able to get away with certain plays. But I would say Flame and, for instance, Save actually has been getting a lot more criticism now after they, weren't able to win last season of Champions. I noticed he had a bit of immunity too in the beginning, but now it's just like, oh, Save can only play Shyvana, and remarks like that come out. So yeah, I would say it varies from player to player, but as we said last time, the worst can be really the worst in maybe the world in terms of what kind of negativity they receive. But the best definitely have it a little bit easier.
One thing I've always noticed as a trend on Reddit is the kind of people where when a player's doing badly, they come out in full force and they say, oh shit, he was never any good anyway, you guys all overhyped him and he's never going to be good again. Those people, if the player then becomes good, like say the meta shifts in his favor again, they tend to, like, I always make a joke and say they go back under the rock that they came out from. Like, you never hear from them again, okay? They never appear and say like, oh, I know I really criticized him, but actually he is good now, or maybe I was wrong. You never ever will see those posts, okay? They don't exist. Is it like that in Korea? Because there's an example we can use now is obviously Dade, because he went from being like really, really good to like terrible in the World Championships. We all remember what a traumatic experience that was to watch, but now he seems really good again. How has the fan reaction been for him?
Oh, it's pretty much the same. In fact, there were a lot of posts in Korea where certain fans of Sanderson would be like, oh, so where are all the haters now? Like, where did you guys all go? Inven used to be filled with all these haters for Dade, and you would see these comments, or especially in the case of Dade worldwide, he used to be kind of known as the patch player. Of course, now he's proven himself, I would say, rather differently. But yeah, those kind of, I think, just attitudes towards pros in the larger community is pretty much the same in the West and Korea. There might be some different nuances, but just how they react, and then, as you said, certain haters perhaps not resurfacing if a player does well, that remains the same even in Korea.
Is there like a player in Korea? I always wondered this, because in the West, a big trend we still have is some players who might not have ever been that good, or might not have been good recently, but they once were good, and they get like undue, like they get like a holdover sentiment, like, oh no, he's still really good even if he's not that good now, like a legacy player. Or sometimes you just have a player where it's almost like because everyone else goes so hard on them, people go the other way and they want to be like, nah, I think he's quite good. Is there like a player like that in the Korean community where they have like a special affection for this player? We might think strange if we're just an observer.
I mean, I would say Mad Life, I think, is the biggest one. And just because of the sheer number of fans he still has, is definitely no longer reflected upon his performance. Not to say that he's a terrible player now, but just because he really was like a god in League of Legends, you know, during the first couple seasons, and now he's no longer. But the number of fans remains the same, if not growing. I would say that really comes out of a lot of sentiment, just because, you know, he's still one of the first generation players that remains. He's always very just collected during interviews. You know, he seems like a nice guy, and so Mad Life is one of them. You know, I'd say a lot of the CJ players actually probably hold that. CJ teams, whether it's with the coaches or the fans, they have a lot of sentimental value because these guys have been around for a long time, and they were the kings of League of Legends in the first year. So Ambition, even Shy to an extent, although he's relatively newer compared to Ambition and Mad Life. Aside from that, I would say, for instance, before Reaper retired, I think Reaper, a lot of his fans still kind of felt that way, or he actually, like you said, got some newer fans who were like, oh, well, you know, he used to be that legend, you know, that Jax player, that Irelia player, despite perhaps his performance on Jin Air. So that's pretty much true, although in Korea, I would say, other than Mad Life, it holds a lesser effect just because of how quickly teams can shift in power. Like SKT, right? Just a very good example. When they first came out, I mean, Faker got a lot of fans his first season, but the team didn't really. Like, they didn't have highlights of the team or anything. It was just like Faker's Nidalee, Faker's Orianna. Then the season after, they won, and then they went to Worlds, so they won Worlds, and from then on, suddenly there was a huge just shift in just number of fans, I would say, in the fan space. Similar with Najin. In fact, a very fun fact is that a lot of Najin Sword fans, the original Najin Sword fans, actually kind of just left the fan club, and then they have now been bandwagoning a little bit, and so they're notorious for that. You know, there are things like that, but just because power shifts so quickly in Korea, I would say you don't see that as much, because most people will easily bandwagon, and for good reason, because the winning team is usually that much better. That's what we saw with Samsung Blue last season in Champions. I can't blame anyone if they're like, oh, now I'm a Blue fan. By all means, please go ahead. So other than Mad Life, I wouldn't say it has as much as a lasting effect.
When Mad Life was at his peak, obviously everyone used to say, like, there's even people who used to say maybe he's like the best player in all of League of Legends. Never mind the position, you know, because like he's so amazing from in theory, one of the weaker positions. And so I think like that's like a moment where everyone said, oh, this one guy's the best, and then obviously Faker's another point where everyone said, okay, he's the best. In general, do Koreans think that way? Do they like rank all the players and go, this guy's the absolute best? Do they think more like, oh, these are just the best at this position? What's like the general way of thinking about the game, do you think, for the fandom?
I would say nowadays it is by position, just because of how the game's grown, and just the insight that even the Korean community has gotten from whether it's players or you know, analyses on different games on how each lane is played. For instance, especially I think in any region, a lot of the professional top laners, I think, feel this the most, because top lane probably has the most unseen, meticulous playing that's necessary to really excel in that position. You know, mid lane, it really is kind of a battle for blood or being completely passive. Bottom lane, you have the duo synergy, and jungle is really about reading the map. But top lane, nowadays, we hear more on, say, lane management, how to manage your minion wave, things like that. But even now, I don't think anyone can confidently say, I really understand how top lane works, because there's just so much more to it. You know, it's a longer lane. There's the 1v1, but then there's the junglers, you know, and now with teleport being used more often, you know, you have to take that into account. Just so many factors. I think Korea is starting to accept that a bit more too, and it helps that there really isn't a player anymore who seems to shine enough to overshadow everyone in every position. Even Faker, especially after recently he lost in a 1v1 to dade 3-0 in the TLOL Korean kind of special web episode. You know, after that it's like, okay, well, now who do we go to? You know, like dade has proven that he's better at mid than Faker, at least for now, and Faker has fallen. Mata is great, but for support, you know, it's very clear, support and map vision. So people are really categorizing a lot more, even in Korea, I'd say. And in that sense, when I look at these trends, it's interesting to note that I do think League of Legends is becoming more globalized, because now more and more each region is catching up to the others in different aspects, that everyone's starting to look at it in a relatively same viewpoint rather than before.
Whenever there's an interview or an AMA or anything with a Korean by the West, this is a really bad trend I've noticed in AMAs. All fans do in the West is sort of spam them with questions about, like, asking for validation of Western players, basically. So if it's Faker, you'll ask him, like, oh, what do you think of Bjergsen? Is Froggen good? And they're like really hoping that he says, like, yeah, he's good. So they can be like, see, he says he's good. And obviously in that scenario, even if he didn't think so, there's no way Faker or someone's going to be like, nah, I think they're all terrible compared to me. Like that's he doesn't gain anything from that. He's just going to get haters, you know. So as a result, unfortunately, it's almost like sort of like a feedback loop where all the Western fans hear it and they go, oh, phew, our players are good enough, okay. From the players themselves and like the fans in Korea, are there really players they still think of, or like they actually do believe in the West? Like, no, this guy, even if he's not Korean, he is really good. Like, he actually could be as good at a position. Or do you get a sense that they really do still hold people in high regard? I mean, I know way back they used to think of like Diamond Prox and stuff like that. Is there anyone now though in the modern day that they still think of in that way?
Yeah, even among pros, I would say, for instance, Froggen, I know his name still gets mentioned quite a bit when talking about Western scene and Western players. And of course, it's really hard to tell, even with me, you know, I can't always assume they're going to give me their 100% honesty. But what I do notice is they're willing to at least recognize star players for each region as a star. For instance, Froggen. I think Froggen is probably the best remaining example. Like you said, Diamond Prox really used to get a lot of love from Korea. Just whether he slumped or not, all the junglers were like, I still watch Diamond Prox. I still learn from him. He's ahead of the meta so often. Things like that. Even with Froggen, I'd say a lot of mid lane players still give him respect, even if they think they can beat him in a 1v1. Just the effect he has for his team. A lot of people are starting to look at that too. What kind of team factor do they play? And you know, in NA, I think it's a bit iffy, because in NA, for instance, a lot of players held I guess a lot of sentimental value because they were the originals for Korean fans, and then NA technically slumped a little bit in the global rankings, and now they're back and stronger. But because there's so much League of Legends, a lot of Korean fans I've noticed just don't know who's who anymore in NA. So it's really hard to say, oh, I think this player is really that good, because they're just like, oh, I heard C9 is good, I heard TSM is doing better, I heard CLG is doing better, but you know, you don't really hear about, people don't say, oh, I think, I guess Medios to a certain extent, but a lot of fans just don't really know the actual players. They just kind of know team names because of All-Stars or because of LCS rankings. I do bi-weekly reports on NA and EMLCS for daily esports here in Korea, and more often than not, a lot of the comments I get in the comment section are, I don't know who any of these players are anymore. I remember like Hotshot back in the day, you know, these fans are fans from season 1, and so they're like, oh yeah, I heard LMQ went to NA, and it's good to see they're doing well. Or they'll be like, oh yeah, I heard Seraph went and Afromoose back with Double Lift. They'll say these things, but they're like, C9, I know they're good, but man, I can't recognize who's who anymore, even by name or by face. You know, they're just kind of a team to me. So NA is in a special place where I'd say, because they don't have as many star players from season 1 remaining, it's hard for Korean fans to connect to an individual player in NA, whereas EU still has certain players remaining that have been around for a long time, you know, XPEK, Froggen, that they can kind of get behind. But once they retire, I think it's going to be the same with the EU. It's just that there's just so much League of Legends to catch up on. Even in Korea, when we had Champions and Masters, 2 tournaments to follow, and so many new names in Korea too, right? So many rookies becoming like star players. So fans are willing to just be like, I'll just keep note of the team names, and then come All-Stars, come Worlds, we'll see how they do. And if I like them, I'll like the team, but I don't know if I have enough time and effort really to pour into getting to know a certain player in the West.
in the last year and a half or so, even though Western fans will obviously compare their region to Korea, the only real region which could compare itself was probably China, because they had, okay, with World Elite, they actually maybe had the best team, and then since then they've had teams where, like OMG, where you could think maybe they could compete, maybe if it was the right matchup, they could win even. How do the Koreans actually think of China? Because I know just if we ignore League of Legends, it's not exactly always the best relationship between these countries in this little area of the world. So does that carry over into the League of Legends? Are people like a bit, I don't want to say racist, just a bit like xenophobic, like, oh, they don't like Chinese people and vice versa? Do they actually respect the Chinese region and think they have good players? How do they think in that sense?
I think China, just by performance, has lost of its respect in Korea, a lot of their respect in Korea. There definitely is kind of that rivalry between China and Korea, and for every esports title, I think that's existed, except for maybe StarCraft actually, but you know, Warcraft it existed, League of Legends it existed for a while, certain just Asian games and card games. Now with Hearthstone, we're seeing kind of OGN trying to bring that back, and before Hearthstone, the only card game that really took off in Asia was one called Yuhi Wang, and there was some Chinese-Korean rivalry there too. So I think in esports that's just a regional rivalry, just kind of like we see in NA and EU. You know, NA and EU players always trying to one-up each other. So that exists, but overall, I'd say community, and definitely in the pro scene, whether it's analysts or players, Chinese teams have lost a lot of their respect from Korean players. They're, especially this year, they're just starting to really come out and say, we don't really know what China's doing anymore. They still seem to have so much potential, but they just seem so behind the meta, and not in terms of actual picks and bans or things like that, but in terms of research. You know, R&D seems to be lacking in the Chinese scene, as what a lot of the pros and coaches will say, and they're starting to really pay more attention to NA and EU LCS, I think, than the say LPL or GPL, things like that. So it's been interesting. Like you said, even just last year, there was a lot of focus on Chinese players, Chinese teams, getting to know them. Koreans always trying to scrim Chinese teams, but these days, scrims with Chinese teams are really only if they have to prepare for a global event, and that is the easiest because of ping. You know, that's really the only times I hear of regular scrims. Before, I think, or earlier this year, like still when it was winter, there were still a handful of Chinese teams like OMG and IG. Korean teams would still be willing to scrim against regularly, but other than that, China as a region had really kind of fallen off the grid for Korea for a couple months now.
So obviously there's a big trend at the moment of people who are like second tier players from Korea going to other regions. So some of them seemed like a joke. Okay, like when they went to Brazil, everyone was like, what? But okay, it makes more sense that like someone with money in NA can get a player who's like maybe dropped off a bit, and then obviously China is just over the road. You can get people to go there, and they have a lot of money as well. So it makes sense. But even so, I get the sense that fans think it's going to go just more and more and more. Like it's going to go crazy. Eventually, it's going to be like, as soon as you do drop off in Korea, you know, it'll be like cursed mad life, and it'll be, you know, they think it'll be like this eventually, and that one day they'll just filter all the way out. The reason I want to ask you like about how you think that will go is because I remember when Loco Doco went to CLG, and people thought, oh right, so Western teams could just get Koreans now. But that was kind of like an unusual circumstance, and I even thought back then like the logistics are still pretty crazy to get a guy from Korea, get him over the visas, or like there's a lot to go through to get it done. So I thought most of the time, if they have an option in their region, they'll probably just go with that, even if it's a worse player. What's your sense? Will we eventually get all the like second tier Koreans? Like everyone who was good now, when they drop off, will they go to the other regions, do you think? Will we eventually just have like the Korean B League will be like LCSNA, and then China will have half Koreans? What do you think?
I don't know if it'll get to that point, and I know a lot of people kind of compare the situation with what they seem to think has happened with StarCraft, and I would say that is not a proper discussion, just because I think there's so many different factors that played into the two different titles, StarCraft and League of Legends, and how they play out regionally. Okay. So that's another huge discussion on its own. But like you said, I think first of all, if they do still have an offer in Korea, even if it's say a lesser team or an amateur team, a lot of players will be inclined to stay here, just because I actually find it quite impressive that just now, we don't even have that many yet, but just the handful of players that have gone overseas, especially to NA, I'm very impressed by the courage they have to just be like, all right, I'm going to go to a foreign country that I have probably never visited, or maybe for a tournament once or twice, and I'm going to live there for a career that is not technically stable. That takes a lot of courage, and I know as much as these guys love gaming, a lot of these guys are often scared. I mean, I know tons of players are scared of going to foreign tournaments and spending a weekend there. They're like, what do I eat? Am I going to be able to sleep well? Like, I don't know, am I going to survive? What if I get lost? Like, these are all concerns they have. It's just like traveling. So to really go there, it's right now we're seeing, first of all, for instance, I mean, obviously Loco Doco going to TSM is, like, he's been in the US, so Loco is a little bit of an exception. Seraph, I think, is also an exception in the case that he had so much drive to become a pro player in any region just to try to prove himself. I would say that is, but other players, it's usually players who are either much younger, so in some sense they're ignorant enough to be, you know, not scared of anything, or say, you know, people asking like Lustboy, oh, like, are you gonna go to a Western team? And when I look at Lustboy, I wouldn't be surprised because he's been to so many foreign tournaments. He's used to that environment now. But I don't think there's gonna be enough players willing to make that move geographically to really flood a foreign market. And we'll have to see, especially because it's a team game. You know, again, if it was one-on-one, it's like, all right, you know, I'll just live like near Koreatown in a big city. I'll live on my own, or in the team house, I'll just do my own thing, and I'll do that. But when it's a team game, I mean, you have to consider the factor of having to live and work with 4 other people who may or may not speak Korean. I would be interested, but I don't think it's going to be as big of a switch as people are worried about. Also because you have to take into account like what the parents might think. Like the parents might be lenient enough to let them try this in Korea, but you know, to move away from their home, it might be seen as very rebellious, and I would say that's going to play into the hands of a lot of these players, and which is why I think right now we can see a lot of these players who have been around thinking about moving. But again, because power switches so quickly, I think within the next year, players might shine for one season and then drop off. That I don't think is going to convince their family or their fans enough to support them going to a different region. Right now we're looking at players who have been in the scene, have had big names for 2 years, year and a half. You know, that's a much more acceptable. Even the parents will be like, okay, you've proven yourself for a year, you did hard work, we'll think about it, you know, we'll let you go do your thing. But you know, with how teams switch now, you know, it's hard to call who's going to win, who's going to drop. For instance, like Notch and White Shield, you know, like what happened? You know, they went to the finals. They were, if anything, maybe the favorites for certain people, but they just kind of dropped off, and then this season they look even worse. So when that happens, I don't think, you know, if suddenly Save is like, all right, now I'm going to go to a Western team, I don't think people are going to be that excited about it, because he didn't prove himself for long enough to hold that reputation. And so I don't think it's as big of a concern as people make it out to be, and especially in terms of compared to StarCraft, just again, it's a 1v1 game, so that's a huge difference. And then there's the factor of just how the tournament structures have changed for StarCraft itself over time. Many changes that it's gone through, and then even now WCS versus LCS has a lot of differences in how the tournament structure works. I think that lends itself to maybe giving a little bit more leeway for the Korean players to feel comfortable going to a foreign region, but I don't think that's as easy in League of Legends.
If for some reason Korea, with the World Championships held in Korea, didn't win the World Championships, would the world just fucking melt down in Korea? Would people just lose their shit completely and like flame every player? And like even if it was a team who, okay, maybe some Chinese team did emerge and they played wonderful style that no one, TPA style, okay, they play some sort of style we haven't seen before and it just works, and like, wow, you have to give them credit. Like, would people actually do that?
You know, I never really thought about that. And not to say I auto-assume Korea will win, although I know most people do, and I think it's very possible. I definitely give it a plus 90% chance on a Korean team winning Worlds this year. Man, I think there would be a split, but I actually think it won't be as negative as one might assume, because here's the thing, even Koreans, I think, are a little bit bored of Koreans always winning. You know, they have the pride, they're like, Korea should win, but when SKT, you know, who technically wasn't doing well, goes and, you know, has a perfect score at All-Stars, people are like, oh, it's good to see SKT doing well, but then a lot of people are like, that was anticlimactic. that wasn't as big of an event as I hoped All Stars would be. I wanted it to be this clash of regions, but it was just SKT doing their thing again, and it was fun. But people in Korea, I think, are craving more and more good League of Legends over the star teams, and so that's why I think Samsung Blue, although they have a lot less fans, and so technically ticket sales were slower for the finals last season in Champions, I'd say the community after they won the finals has really turned things around, and they're like, that was really fun to watch, and because of what Samsung Blue did to the meta, and then what teams were able to experiment with in Masters, now in Champions we're seeing a lot of teams willing to go a little bit crazier in game to try to prove their mettle, and that provides for more exciting games, and I think that has really rejuvenated the fan space a little bit here in Korea, and I think that's what people have been craving. I talk to, whether it's community, whether it's fans who visit, especially fans who visit, if I'm at the studio and I'm leaving, and some people come up to talk to me and I'm like, oh, what'd you think of the games? They're like, it was nice, my favorite team won, so that's that, but it was a bit boring. It was a quick 2-0, or it was a super drawn out 2-0 with just, it was just going to be this choking them out, after 50 minutes. And they don't want to see that every game anymore, even if their favorite team wins. So here's what I'm thinking. If Korea were to lose, like you said, it's probably going to be because of some very new, innovative way of playing, or just absolutely better play. And I think Korean fans would be impressed enough by that maybe after the first set they might be in shock, but by the time the finals are over, they would just be excited to see this happen, to see that kind of play. And then afterwards, there might be some hate until the next season starts in Champions. There might be a lot of hate going towards Korean communities, like, oh, look, you guys, I'm sure there will be phrases like this, right? Oh, Korea's been too arrogant. Korea should have watched out a little bit more. But that will be after the tournament. I think, like, at the finals in the venue, people would still cheer. It will be just as exciting, and in fact, that team whichever foreign team makes that happen, will probably gain a ton of fans in Korea. And while there might be hate during the off season, I think once the season starts, people would actually have higher expectations, and it will create for more of a vibrant community. So that would be exciting, I think.
If we look at some historical examples of the Korean coaching staff or the organization recruiting a new player, there's some really amazing examples. Like, obvious ones would be like Flame and Shy replace players who themselves were top players of that position, and then they're even better, actually. So it's like, wow, you got a guy completely out of nowhere, you must be really like a great talent scout. And then the best example is probably SK Telecom, because they got the entire team pretty much, out of nowhere. And originally people thought, oh, it's just going to be Faker and 4 dudes, and like, no, they became really, really good as well. On one hand, that makes it look like, oh, Korea's just got the formula down. They're like a factory for making great players, and then they know exactly which one to pick and put it with him. But then I've also noticed you get all these teams, like the Najin teams, the CJ teams, where they have all the fans in the world, all the money, all the fame, the past glory, but they've struggled for all these seasons to get back to the top again. They're not necessarily quite there, except for maybe Shield's one little run. And then SK Telecom, okay, if Koma was the genius who made SK Telecom K, well, apparently he also made S as well, and I think we can make our own minds up on that. So what I want to ask is, like, what do you think the actual level of competency in that sort of area is, like scouting and putting the teams together? Are there some people who are just brilliant and they really do come up with the results? Is it like hit and miss? What do you think of this? Because it seems kind of like hard to get a bead on how well they're doing there.
I'd say there's definitely a select few, especially when I've talked to them, just a select few coaches or coaching staff members who do shine. They themselves definitely have their own formula, and it seems to work. And it makes sense when I talk to them, even if they can't make it happen with their organization at the moment. Just listening to what they have in mind or what they say they look for, I'm like, that makes a lot of sense, and that's really impressive. I wish that you kind of had more freedom, or if you went to a different region, I wonder how that would look. And a lot of coaching staffs talk to me. They're like, this is what I think I would do if I went to a different region. Like, these are the types of players or the current players that I would get together for a team. And it's very interesting to hear. The issue is, of course, usually it's not a one-man show. There's logistics going on. There's the coaching staff usually is 3 or plus members in Korea. So then obviously you have to work through all of those members. You have to come to an agreement together. And different teams have different methods, where certain teams might have one coach for one team and coach number 2 for team B, where other teams might have all the coaches helping both teams. So depending on the structure, there's definitely obstacles, or one could say, for these select few to really do their own thing and try to make up their dream team scenario. And I think T1K is the best example of that, because KaKAO was kind of free to do whatever he wanted, made it work. Like you said, we're not seeing the same effect with S, and I do wonder if that was actually KaKAO maybe just being a little bit rushed or over-ambitious because they wanted a second team after Reaper's team didn't work out. So I wonder if that's why he perhaps wasn't able to get exactly what he wanted, or he could have just been mistaken. You know, who knows? I think with KaKAO, we'd have to wait and see. But one thing's for sure, he definitely proved himself with K, and I think the players all respect him in that regard themselves. They're like, he really brought us up. So there's that for KaKAO. And I would say that the Samsung team coaching staff has also really proven themselves in terms of strategy. Not so sure about players just because they haven't had too many switches, so we'd have to wait and see until they have more retired players. But in terms of strategy, I think they've proven themselves very well, and of course certain credit goes to a couple of the players themselves. But you look at just how they interact with their coaching staff backstage and things like that. Clearly a very open communication. The coaching staff plays a big role, so I'd say they've proven themselves. And CJ, like you said, used to have kind of the stronghold in scouting. Haven't seen really the same results anymore, but I'd say you know, CJ and Najin too, when I talk to them, people have ideas, but certain times it's also this, it's that they have two people who both have good formulas, but they're different, and the coaching staff then clashes over that, and you know, neither one really comes to fruition because you kind of have to agree and compromise in the middle. So I actually wouldn't be surprised if maybe after this year we actually start seeing more movement in coaching staff members rather than just players. You know, maybe coaches trying to figure out what their ideal environment is rather than just working with what they've got. I'd really like to see that.
Even though he's banned, so in Korea, like, I'm probably not even supposed to talk about this, like the Riot Korea might have like a sniper already prepared to stop this interview, but do the fans and the pros and the coaches and stuff, ignoring the fact that Apdo is banned, do they secretly think like, no, he is really good, and listen, if he was unbanned for some reason, we'd give him a try and we'd test him out, like you know, the hype, because it's such a sexy story, like what if the best player actually doesn't even play right now? What if there's a guy who could beat Faker? It's like a cool story, you know, because we already see everyone else and they can't do it, or they do it slightly. What's the actual sentiment like in Korea, ignoring the cultural aspect of like, don't talk about him because he's banned or something like that?
I mean, community definitely, if his name ever gets mentioned anymore, which it has died off quite a bit because it's been some time now, but even when he was banned, a lot of the community definitely went off and they were like, man, we're going to miss out. We're never going to get to see this guy play. Like, I was so excited. And I think certain players give him credit in terms of individual play, but I actually haven't heard too many coaching staff members talking as if they would have interest in him because of, I think, attitude more than skill. Because coaching staffs obviously have to think about, can they work with him, regardless of how good he might be. And I think a lot of them were concerned with, it doesn't matter if he's a superstar, if we can't mold him, or if he can't work with us, you know, if he can't listen to us and accept the fact that while he might be the best player, he has room to improve and someone else might have insight, then we wouldn't want to work with him. I think that thought train is very big in Korea. And we've seen, you know, other players kind of get put on the bench for certain reasons. You know, for instance, Insec had some trouble getting his foot in the door because of the same issue. It's like, it doesn't matter if he's good, like we can't work with him. We're not even going to give him a shot. And I know a lot of tryouts, people who have tried out, actually, of listening to coaches, they're like, oh yeah, you know, there's this guy, and they'll like tell me the ID and I'll look up his record, like great player, and they're like, he was good, but man, his attitude, like he just kind of like talks as if he already knows everything, and you just can't have that attitude when you enter a team. You have to accept the fact that coaches are observing from a third perspective, and they will give you insight, and they're just not willing to do that, so we can't take him. And so they put a lot of weight on that, and I think that holds true for Apdo also.
When you are in one of these team houses, I've noticed like a weird scenario where it feels like, I think part of, like, my personal theory as to why people don't repeat as champions or even win a second time in OGN, like what tends to happen is the team rises, wins, and then maybe they're still good, or maybe they drop off, but they almost never go back up to the top again. It's very rare. Is that the lifestyle is so brutal that like when you're going up to winning, you don't know what it takes to win yet. Like you're willing to put everything in, and then when you win, it's like yes. And so while you're winning, okay, you'll still put in the effort. But if you then have like a bad spell or a slump, then it feels like, oh, I know I'm gonna have to put all that effort in again to get back to the same spot. So now it's like, it's hard to motivate yourself again, you know. You've already kind of like tasted the rewards, so it's like what real motivation is to go and do it again, where you're already famous, you're in a good team, you can maybe still do okay, even if you're trying that much. So I get the sense that like people get burned out really easily, especially because with the lifestyle, it's very hard to have like a girlfriend or time off and all these things that you'd want if you were successful, you know. Is there a world possible in a year, in 5 years, where you can be a pro gamer in Korea? You could play 8 hours a day, you could practice really hard, live in a team house, but you get some time off. Because I get the sense, unfortunately, like I'll give the example like this. One of the reasons it was actually really hard for me to get interviews last year was because the teams who were winning were like, well, we're winning, so we have to practice a lot right now. We can't do interviews. And you're like, okay, fair enough. Then the teams who were losing were like, well, we're losing, so we have to practice even more. And it's like, wait a minute, this is like, how do you ever get out of this cycle? And so I can see how people are getting burned out, because I think to myself like, okay, there must be a world in which if you're losing, the answer can't just be practice more and more and more. In fact, sometimes in the West, if you were, I had like a sports psychologist, he might be like, no, take some time off and recover and then come back and build your way, you know, like it almost sounds like a penance. Like if they're doing badly, they feel like, oh, I have to play even more, like to punish myself and get better. Will this always be Korean culture? Will there ever be like a more chilled out Korea in the future?
It's hard to imagine one. I think the other thing is, so of course I'm kind of talking umbrella statements here, but Korea or a lot of East Asian cultures, children are already so restricted at a young age, and so that's why, for instance, I'll talk about Korea. Korean students are notorious for being smart. They study hard. They'll go to foreign schools and they'll always get top scores. But in Korea, they will always just fall off as soon as they enter college, because that's when they taste their first actual freedom, and they just spend all of it, drinking away, partying, and they just give up on studying, and they can just get by. They can graduate, and because of what they've built up, they can still have the reputation and the intellect to get their job done. But the point is that it doesn't continue. Like you said, they get burnt out. They taste freedom, and they're like, why would I give this up? I'm just gonna enjoy this while I have it right now, because the other fear is I don't know when I won't have it anymore, because they lived for 18 years not having it. So they're like, what if I don't have it after I graduate from college? Like, I have to enjoy it when I'm in college. And probably true, because once you start your job, you're probably not going to be able to do that. So the reason why I think a lot of people would be hesitant to give that leisure, and I agree with you theoretically, is that sometimes it is better to actually just give more time off to really recharge, recuperate. But in Korea, I also don't blame people for maybe being afraid of that, because a lot of these players, right, they graduate only middle school and then they enter this cycle. Until then, they were either studying really hard or getting yelled at to study really hard while playing games. So they don't really have experience with the world. So you have to actually be a little bit concerned. If I let them completely off the hook for an extra week, will I ever be able to bring them back in? Will they ever want to actually come back in? Or will they just want to continue that anymore? And at this point, you actually also have to think about just the age group we're talking about. We're talking anywhere from 16 to 21-year-olds usually, or 22. If this is all they've tasted, yeah, I'm not so sure if this theory can really work of giving them just an extra week when their whole life they've never really tasted it. And so then, man, an extra week is probably not going to satisfy their hunger and thirst for the different lifestyle they can have and just resting. And so they're probably going to want it more, at which point there lies the danger of negative snowballing, where they just fall into this downward spiral, and you may never be able to get them back, or they may never just want to come back. So the concern, I would say, is real, just because of how the background most players come from before they actually enter the pro scene, and also because in Korea, you know, when you're given time off, usually if you're of drinking age, the default is to just go out and get plastered, and that's kind of the standard, you know, stereotype. And so if that is your way of resting, you could argue, is that really resting? You know, like you're not just going on vacation, like you're just staying still in Seoul in a big city. And that's why I know a lot of teams encourage players when they do have vacation to go back home. A lot of these players aren't actually from Seoul. You know, go back home, because I think anyone who lives in a metropolis knows it gets stressful sometimes, just because everyone's always so busy. You kind of want to escape from that, and these players may not know that how good that can be for them. So a lot of coaches I know encourage their players to really go out, you know, get out of the city, go to your family, or if you're gonna stay, just like relax, go watch a movie. Don't, you know, go out eating and drinking. So there's that much. But yeah, I'm not so sure if we can really imagine a much like less strict Korea in the future in the pro scene.
Recently, the new OGN intro came out, and these are always very well enjoyed. And okay, on one level they're a bit cheesy, because if you know any of the players, it's like it actually looks a bit silly to see them doing like all matrix moves and stuff, but it looks really cool. And if you were a fan who didn't know the player, it would build him up to be like, what an epic, like Faker always looks badass in them, and then they always have mad life. And that's a good thing I've noticed. They'll always, once they've established a star, like even when Reaper was with Jin Air, they would still put him in the commercial, and they kind of like were establishing like, here are all the stars of the league, and here's like the new guy who might be the star, here's the old guy that you love. And it was like a way of like, it was almost like a TV show, you know, like a drama, like introducing the characters, you know. But I've noticed in the West, even now in the world where, okay, Riot definitely has the budget and the people who have cameras and stuff who could do that, they don't really do that. In general, they don't even take like that player approach, that star approach. Is there a reason why Korea loves that approach so much, and why the West just seems to ignore it pretty much, even to this day, you know?
That's a really good point, and it really comes down to, like you said, it's like a drama. When I talked to the directors in OGN, when I first came in, they were always like, we always have to focus on the storyline. And they were actually concerned if they could do that with League of Legends, because it's a team game, especially if teams keep switching out too fast. Will there be a storyline? You know, it's just 5 new players. Of course, we've seen that's not true anymore, and we do have a lot of storylines now in League of Legends, and the directors are very thankful of that. But they really prioritize that, exactly, creating that drama, and obviously not fabricating it. But that's why, for instance, I know for a fact a lot of directors get, they're like, oh man, like, because they're not fans of any certain team, because, you know, they're directors, and a lot of these guys are much older. They just like watching the game, and they're like, oh, I hear this player is good. But I know sometimes they'll be disappointed if the brackets just don't really lend themselves to a good storyline. You know, either it's like all new teams, or none of the rivals got to meet up, let's say in the quarterfinals. Then the directors are like, man, like the games might be good, but how do we go from here? You know, how are we going to create that final intro? Will there be like a whole road to victory storyline for any team who gets to the finals? And they start racking their brains, starting from the quarterfinals, for that storyline. They start looking at all 8 teams, who is probably the favorites, and how can we really pick out what to highlight so that the fans feel connected to them in terms of the road they had to travel to get to that point. Whereas I would say, just from watching, obviously I haven't really gotten to talk in depth with Riot or their production crew about this, but from watching, I think for one, the West, actually not even just Riot, the West in general, maybe is a bit too concerned again with the word sports. You know, they're trying too hard to just be like an already established sports channel such as ESPN. And while I think ESPN has great production value, they do take a very news sports, that kind of approach. And they talk about storylines. You know, they talk about, oh, like, will this player come back from an injury? There are those storylines, but it's talked more for the sake of debate and not dramatic effect. You know, it's really there just to discuss it and just to have something to analyze, rather than to really hype up the story of, say, a miracle child or something like that. You don't see that as much anymore in I would say, sports channels, and I think that's what the Western esports broadcasters focus a bit too much on, because that's what they see. They see that as sports, and they want to emulate that, which I think is a good start, but perhaps you need a little bit more push in the dramatic value, precisely because it's not the actual players we watch for the majority of our broadcasts. It's the game, it's the game characters. And so, of course, yeah, like there's Twitter and there's social media, but we actually don't get to be as connected to the players as, say, traditional sports, because in traditional sports, if someone gets injured, you see that on screen, like they bump their head, or whatever, they get sent out, or, if they flop, even things like that. We see it in real life, but in esports, sure, we have player cams these days, but even then, like, it's a little bit of frustration, or there's not as much emotional value to the players during the actual game. And I think that's why it's really nice. And I don't know if that's why OGN started doing this, but in my opinion, that's why it is nice to have this push in the dramatic direction. And like you said, I know a lot of fans, if they're first watching like OGN, they're like, oh, this is a bit cheesy. And yeah, you can think of it that way, but at the same time, it is just an intro. I don't foresee OGN attempting to make a TV sitcom out of these players anytime soon, so we don't have to worry about that. Just take it for what it is. Like you said, take it for instance, what I really liked, and I'm glad you noted this, is Faker kind of doing the same pose as Zed, kind of like preparing his fist and fire coming out of it. It really shows that he's going at it again. He has to climb back up. There is a lot of that underlying emotional value, and you may not notice it the first time you watch it, and you may never really note it until someone tells you, but it's going to be there in the back of your head. That's why you're going to be drawn to this. For instance, Mad Life, he always looks calm and collected. They always put him in that scene that has its own pause. The music drops off. They make sure this works out, and I love it. And that's one of the reasons I really fell in love with OGN when I first got here, as someone who got to be a part of it rather than a fan, because of how focused directors are on storyline. We have to bring out the storyline. It's on us to draw people in, to give players more fans. It's on us to really make these guys their own characters and not just a guy sitting behind a keyboard and mouse. And I would like to see that a bit more in Western broadcasts. And I would say, if anything, I would say ESL, I think, tries their hand at it a bit more than other established broadcasters at the moment in the West. And I definitely like what they do. For instance, with WCS last year, that's what I've noticed, and I like that. But just a bit more. Right now, I think even with ESL, you're still experimenting with the basics that you have, like interviews, bring out the actual words. But OGN is at a point where you don't use actually words anymore. In fact, that's the last resort. I know a lot of the assistant directors, when finals time comes, they start stressing out because they're like, oh, like I've been charged with the new video this year, and I just don't know, like there's all these mini storylines, but I can't do a mashup, then it's not going to have the high impact. So which one do I bring out? And oftentimes they'll ask me, or they'll be like, or they'll ask the other Korean commentators, they'll be like, which games do you think were the most high octane or impactful? Did you see any emotional value in the players? Do you remember a scene of when we had the player on camera? They really take that into account too, where they looked super happy or sad. KaKAO's dance, very good example. That had so much value to the broadcaster, because it's like, we can use this for any sort of montage of showing what it means to be in esports. So yeah, I'd like to see more focus on that. And I keep saying OGN directors, that is at the very core, because again, they have other people to help with the actual tournament bracket organizing and format, things like that. So the main director, his concern is always, how do I make this dramatic? How do I really highlight the certain factors to make it dramatic but not fabricated? They want to meet that fine balance, and they do a good job of it.
Since you mentioned KaKAO, actually, I had a question about trash talk that I just thought of, which is, when I watched that video they did, the funny video where at the finals they filmed like it was the Masters finals, where he went to all the different team houses, and it was just him like visiting, and everyone was just like roasting him basically as he was eating the food. Like, when they were doing like the banter back and forth, okay, I noticed a really curious like gap between how a Westerner would think of it and how the Korean seemed to, which was when he went to the SK Telecom house and he was sat there, and it was like Impact, and it was two guys from S, and I can't remember which one it was, but the one who was stockier is the way I'll describe it, okay, just one of these S players was, it might have been Bang, was just talking shit to KaKAO, and he made some comment like, about how like, oh, have you ever been to a final? Like implying like, you know, when SK Telecom K beat you in the final when you were in KTB, like, you know, they beat you and stuff. And what I didn't understand about that was that as trash talk in the West just doesn't work, because the Bang guy, if I was KaKAO, I'd be like, well, what have you ever done? You haven't even been to the fucking like semi-finals. You know, how can you talk shit to me? Like, I went to a final, you know. But instead, he just sort of like took the insult, like, oh yeah, I went to a final and I lost. Like, you know, like, what am I missing here? What's the gap there where that actually works as trash talk? Like, is it because he's on a winning team, like in just the organization? Like, how does it work?
I mean, yeah, there's that. There's definitely, you know, Bang is on that organization, and specifically for that video, it was for the Masters final where Bang would have been playing, and many people were hoping SKT could make a comeback. So I think he felt comfortable saying that. And yeah, now that you bring it up, I actually remember having a little bit of a crisis myself mentally, because when I heard the Korean, I'm just like, oh, that's funny, and then I read the translation, I'm like, hold on, yeah, Bang, I don't know if you can say that. You know, I had the same effect, but I would say more than anything, it is because the most recent results is that S, along with K, got to go to the Masters final. KT in Masters did quite poorly, and then the Arrows also previous season, you know, they didn't get to the finals either for champions. I mean, neither team did, but and I would say also, like you said, there is that factor that KaKAO did lose to the SKT organization the one time he got to go to a final, and then ever since then he's been kind of tossed back and forth by the KT organization to try to keep themselves alive. So yeah, I think it's really just they were focusing on kind of the Masters storyline at that point, and KaKAO, you know, knew that, and so he kind of went with it more than anything. I'm sure deep inside KaKAO the same thing, like, whatever, man, at least I've stood on that stage on my own, not even as an organization. But the video was for, you know, the Masters final as a filler, so I think both players were accepting the fact that that was the context, and so basically, at least for that week, S was above Arrows because they were at the finals in Masters, so I think that's how it worked out.
Since the OGN is so competitive, it has the same problem I've noticed that GSL had, which is that, like you were saying, when the producers want a certain storyline to be set up, okay. So for example, if you watch LCSNA, you want it to be TSM versus Cloud9 in the final. You don't, even though on one level it would be cool, it would actually have sucked if Coast had somehow beaten CLG, then beaten TSM and got to play C9. Yeah. Because then it'd be like, well, we all know who's going to win, and now like the cool storyline isn't even there. Well, unfortunately, in like an OGN context, sometimes that happens. Like when MVP beat KTB and then they beat SKT and then they played Blaze. Even though they ended up winning, there was no hype for that final because everyone was like, oh, the cool final would have been KTB versus Blaze, you know, something like that. If you think back now, just think of the context. What do you think the most hyped match in Korean League of Legends ever was? What was the one where before everyone knew, like, no, this is the match we want and this is like, everyone can't wait for this. This could be amazing.
Ooh, that's a really good question. I would say, if anything, I would say either, I'd have to say either Frost versus Sword in the winter of 2013, or, although I wasn't here, I'm actually willing to bet Frost versus CLG EU.
All right.
Might have been the most hyped match. Not necessarily because everyone expected that, but by the time CLG EU made it to the finals, because they were a foreign team, it didn't matter if they weren't the favorites. It's just the fact that you could have this regional clash at that time and age of League of Legends was cool. And at that point, while COGU might not have necessarily been favorites, it wasn't like they were the underdogs either. I mean, foreign fans thought they were amazing, and they were at the time. You know, they were ruling a lot of these tournaments. So I would say actually that one, because Frost were kind of coming back from getting second place to their sister team, so, and they were looking good, so they were kind of this new favorite, especially with Shy, you know, starting to perform really well. And then there's CLGEU, this powerhouse from the West. I'd say that was probably the most hyped up in community, and I'm willing to assume the production crew was crazy about that one, because when do you get a chance like that, right, to see that on your own stage? And then, and that's why I actually think the very first final, while it was Blaze and Frost, was probably not as hyped up, because for one, it was the first final. Two, it was really hard to say. I mean, MIG Frost were the favorites, but it was hard to say if people really thought much of Blaze, and that's why it was an upset for them to 3-0 Frost, but I don't think there was as much expectation there. So either CLG versus Frost or Frost versus Sword. On the flip side, I'd probably say the least typed up match was actually Blue and Shield. I actually think that just because, sure, there's the storyline of Blue of how they're always the off-season kings and they never performed, but that doesn't really mean much to a lot of the fans, because like you said, the turnover rate from player base to esports fans is very small, and from there, dedicated esports fans to just watching regular season is also very different. So Blue surprisingly had a lot less fans. Now it's different, but before they won, had a lot less fans. Shield was always a quiet team that just, you know, they had drawn out games. No one was really too excited about watching them play other than them winning. And I know Blue and Shield, I know also like the production crew really had to just rattle their heads to figure out how to make this a dramatic final, because they were like, they're good teams, like we respect that, but they don't have much of a team storyline. None of their players really had a great like storyline on his own either, whether like he had to really fall down low or something like that. Maybe dade at the most, but that was about it. So I know that was probably the lowest end of finals.
When we did this interview a year ago, your job was like, I mean, you had a fucking insanely long job title. It was like 11 words or something. I was like, that's bullshit, because I used to have to put the title below the thing. So your job used to be something along the lines of like, you worked on the global side with like the foreign fan things, and then you obviously did the translation for the interviews, and you were sort of like, yeah, in some way trying to like expand the English language side of it.
Yeah.
Now you're doing like, you've done the casting in Masters, you do like some Hearthstone stuff, you don't do the translation the same way, you still do that voice, that weird robot voice on the commercials. So what's going on now? Are you in some sort of like identity crisis? Like have you got a set plan now of where you're going in the next 6 months in terms of your career?
I'd actually say I have much less of an identity crisis than last year. Last year I was definitely, I had split personalities, one could say. Starting this year within OGN and for myself, I've definitely established myself more as talent. That is my main path, on-screen talent. And in terms of casting, if it's casting, it's play-by-play, but I would say I'm more drawn towards actual hosting and interviewing, and then but I do like, you know, casting itself, so that's why when I cast, I prefer to do play-by-play, because in a tournament cast, usually that is who plays a host role, unless you have a main stage host. So obviously in OGN, English isn't the main language, so the English side of things, the play-by-play caster has to fill in that role, so I enjoy that. So yeah, that's why I got to really be set as the main caster for Masters and for all these Hearthstone events that we're doing in OGN. That's what I get to hold. And that's probably what I'll continue with for at least the rest of this year. With the World Championship coming up, I've already, you know, I'm discussing with the directors kind of what will be my role, because obviously for All-Stars and last year's Worlds, I got to join the Korean casting side of things to bring in global information and just interviews with foreign players. But now that it's in Korea, will that change? You know, at least part of it in Korea, will that change? Or, you know, maybe I'll do more for the actual global side of things. Maybe we'll produce global content with the Korean teams or something like that. So these are things in the works, but again, it's going to be me as on-screen personality. And you know, with my work with Gem and my manager Toby, that's just really what I want to focus more on now that I've set myself down as on-screen talent. I also feel a bit more natural when I'm on stage. I guess one could say I get less stressed, no matter how hard the schedule might be. I'm always able to get in my zone as soon as I hold the mic or, you know, put on my headset. Whereas I mean, I love office work and I love production especially, or even marketing. Just I love doing it, but there's a very slight difference. I wouldn't say it gets to a point where I'm too stressed out to enjoy it. For instance, last year, like anyone who has gotten to talk to me regularly, or Monty who lived with me, will know I definitely overworked myself a little bit. But even then, if a tournament ended, I would always be happy. I would be like, this was worth it. But when there's definitely a slight difference when I'm on stage and off stage. So there's that. I still do a lot of advising work with the global team. They always like to call me in for meetings, especially when they're brainstorming, because again, they just don't have as much exposure to foreign fans, foreign communities, or foreign tournaments. How do those work? You know, other foreign talent, how do they work? So I still play a role in discussion, but I guess just not as regularly, and therefore I also don't spearhead as many things myself in the office, but more so if we decide, for instance, the live show, it was a very trial run, but once we decide to do it, then I would go in for regular meetings and be like, all right, this is how I imagine this should be. I talked to the director a lot, and we're already talking about hopefully doing a second season and really improving a lot on all the opportunities we missed, really, and we're willing to admit that. You know, it was really, I wouldn't call the show a failure, but just tons of opportunities missed, and so we're really looking forward to try to take advantage of that in the next year. And that's where I see myself even going into 2015, is mainly still on stage and just, you know, putting in what I can, you know, putting in my 2 cents on the office side of things for now. But I think this also gives me more of a different viewpoint than always just being in the office, you know, being able to actually be on stage and being on, I guess, the receiving end of production. You know, I have to work with what I've got if I'm a performer. So that has given me a lot more insight on how production works and who has to kind of give in when. And eventually I do want to go into the office of any, you know, esports organization. You know, I do want to be more of that brainstorming factor, someone who really gets to organize and drive forward certain bigger ideas. But for now, I think this is my place. I think there's a lot more work I can also do for myself, like improvements I can make in my onstage work, and just also changes I can bring to global broadcasting in Korea as an on-screen personality. Once I think I guess the best way to put it is, I don't feel complete yet as a caster, but once I feel that I've done enough work to feel that I've created a chapter in global casting, then I think I'll be able to really comfortably move on to more logistical work. And I want to at some point, because right now, I've talked to this to a lot of different people, but I see esports in any region, even Korea, just overall having stagnated. And because esports itself has become a buzzword, everyone is focusing on just esports. How do we make esports work? And the term esports has really taken place as the actual terminology for what we do. And then because the word sports is in there, the West really starts to focus more on, you know, how do we compare this, or how do we make this likable by traditional sports fans? And there's all these factors going through. And when I look at that, not that I can say I have an answer, but I don't see that as the right direction to move in. I think too many people are focusing on tournament, for one, too much on tournament play. And as weird as that might sound, I think, I mean, we look right now, we have the big three, the international, WCS, LCS going through, and WCS and LCS have a little bit more similar appearances, I guess, in tournament format than the international. But once it gets to the actual stage, you know, we have the group stages, we have the best of fives, you know, we have the best of sevens for certain StarCraft tournaments, and I look at that and people are still poring over that. They're like, tournament format, tournament regions, do we region lock or not? And these are all important questions, but and this goes back to the whole production thing, there's not more focus on actually creating something out of the tournaments. There's just so much focus on making the tournaments happen and making them run smooth, and this is all crucial, but because so many resources are being poured into that, what we get is just a nice, clean broadcast. And I'd like to see that change, whether it's from the actual game side of things, whether we get a new game that forces a change in that scene, or whether it's more broadcasters trying to figure out a different formula for how they, I guess, present this content. I think the presentation is really being overlooked, and not in terms of, you know, quality, but formula. I'd like to really see that, and that's what I eventually want to really sit down and research and bring a big change into esports, and that's where I see myself, say 5 years down the road, is whichever organization I'm a part of at that point, being a part of that force that brings the next chapter of esports in. I think after, you know, I guess one could say in the East, obviously OGN being created was the big news, and then in the West, there were several smaller chapters coming through, especially because Europe and North America got started on different titles, you know, and North America, of course, got huge on consoles for a little bit, and EU definitely on FPSs for a little while. And then it all came together with, say, you know, like ESL being established in Europe, and then MLG trying to get their own broadcasting systems down for North America. And now we have another small chapter with Riot and Blizzard both trying to make their own global system work out, and Riot putting their hand into broadcasting. I think that's all great, but none of this has really changed the face of esports, I think. It's really just been improvements for different regions and different directions, including Korea. Korea's made its own improvements. But when I watch even OGN, it doesn't really feel as novel anymore. You know, I'm just like, I get to watch good games. That's great. I enjoy the games, but I kind of wish that we had something new going on. And I don't think simply a new game will change that, because we saw that with League of Legends. A new game came through, and it's fun, but that's all it is. It's a new game. We don't really change how we see esports, and I know that's what everyone's focusing on. That's why there's so much discussion, like, what does esports mean? You know, do we want to be like sports? And these are all good starts, but I still don't think any of us have figured out the actual channel we want to all drive forward into. We're still just kind of feeling things out. We're trying to figure out, all right, do we turn right or left here? You know, do we go forward? Or should we actually just sit down and take some more time? I think the world as a whole are in that stage, and yeah, I'd like to really be able to spend more time focusing on that. But for now, I want to learn more of what I can on stage than off.
Do you have any final words or someone you want to thank at the end of the interview?
Well, you know, I definitely want to thank Toby, you know, my manager. He's just been great help, especially in terms of helping me kind of gather myself and figure out my identity crisis from last year. So shout out to him and Jem. Of course, Monty has... You know, Monty's pretty much been with me through my whole journey in esports. He was kind of there to help start me up with GG Chronicle. And so I thank him a lot. He's been a great help and support, just more moral support too, but also, of course, just his analysis. I think anyone in League of Legends can respect that. So that's great. Also, shout out to Doa, just having both of those guys out here in Korea with me. And I think all of us feel the same way. It's great company, you know, to have comfort in knowing that we all go through the same things, and we can talk to each other about these, whether it's successes or problems, obstacles we face. That's been a huge help. Of course, shout out to OGN, always Crisis, the head director of the esports department, great legend in esports, and love the guy. And also, I mean, it'd be hard to name all the directors, but all the main directors who really make these shows work out, and the global team too. I've had a very positive experience working with them over the past year and a half. And aside from that, you know, I want to continue to thank my parents. They've been much more supportive, more and more now that they have a better idea of what I'm doing than when I first started. They get to actually see me now on screen. So they've been much more supportive and just much more curious about what I do. And it's nice to be able to talk to them about my plans, just what I picture myself doing 5 years down the road, and have positive feedback from that. And of course, to all the fans, you know, everyone who watches OGN, or people who especially have seen me in different foreign tournaments and want me to continue doing more foreign event work. I would love to, and hopefully I can figure out a schedule where I can keep bouncing back and forth, but look forward to seeing just meeting more and more fans in future events.